Wind howled across snow-drowned plains, scouring bone-white beneath a leaden sky. Silas Thorne, gaunt as the dead pinyon trees, saw her, a specter huddled against a derelict assay office wall, clutching a bundle wrapped in rags. Hunger had hollowed her eyes, etched despair onto a face too young for such ruin. Without a word, Silas pressed his last silver dollar into her frozen hand, a final, desperate act of a man with nothing left to lose. He didn't see the glint of defiance beneath her despair, nor know the weight of the secret she guarded, a secret tied to the very earth beneath Blackthorn consolidated its iron grip. Hoofbeats echoed, distant thunder on the frozen air. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. The coin, warm from his pocket for a fleeting second, felt like ice against the woman's cracked skin. She stared at it, then at Silas, her gaze a turbulent mix of disbelief and a shame that cut him deeper than the Wyoming wind, knifing down from the pass. He'd seen that look before, on faces broken by the basin's relentless grind. His own empty pockets echoed the gesture's futility, yet the tiny, mewling sound from the ragged bundle against her chest anchored his resolve. "Take it," Silas rasped, his voice raw from disuse and cold. He adjusted the worn collar of his sheepskin coat, the wool frayed and smelling of wood smoke and old sweat. "Get something hot for the child." "I ain't a skin for charity, mister," she whispered, the words barely audible over the wind's mournful whine to the assay office's broken windows. But her fingers closed convulsively around the dollar. The bundle in her arms shifted, emitting another weak cry. The sound was fragile, a stark counterpoint to the vast, indifferent silence of Silver Vein Basin in deep winter. Silas scanned the desolate stretch of what passed for a street in this ghost town, clinging to the base of the skeleton peaks. Snowdrift sculpted grotesque shapes against a boarded-up saloon, the skeletal remains of a stamp mill, and a few crumbling adobe shacks that hadn't yet surrendered to the elements. No smoke rose from any chimney. No life stirred, save for the ravens wheeling high above like scraps of charred paper. The storm that chased them down from the high country yesterday had settled in, a suffocating white blanket, promising days more of isolation. She wouldn't last the night out here. Neither would the infant. "Name's Thorne. Silas Thorne," he said, shifting his weight. The worn leather of his boots creaked. "This ain't charity. It's bad investment advice." A flicker of bleak humor touched his eyes, gone as quickly as it came. He nodded towards the least dilapidated shack, its roof sagging but mostly intact, tucked behind the skeletal remains of a livery stable. "That adobe yonder got half a roof still. Better end this." He didn't wait for agreement. Turning, he started trudging through the knee-deep snow towards the shack, trusting the desperate instinct for survival would make her follow. The crunch of his boots was the only sound for a long moment. Then came the softer, labored shuffle behind him. He pushed open the warped plank door, the rusted hinges shrieking protest. Inside, the air was marginally stiller but colder, smelling of damp earth, rodent droppings, and decay. Gray light filtered through cracks in walls and a hole in the sod roof, illuminating dust motes dancing in the frigid air. A broken table, a stool with only 3 legs, and a pile of mildewed burlap sacks in one corner with the sole furnishings. Snow had drifted in near the doorway. Silas kicked some aside, clearing a space near the central fire pit. A shallow depression ringed with blackened stones, filled with cold ash. The woman hovered in the doorway, silhouetted against the white glare, clutching her child like a shield. She looked impossibly young, barely out of girlhood, her dark hair escaping a ragged shawl to frame a face sharp with hunger and exhaustion. Fear wore with a desperate hope in her eyes as she scanned the gloomy interior. "It'll do," Silas stated flatly, already moving. He shrugged off his worn saddlebags, heavy not with provisions but with the few tools of his transient existence. A tin cup, a battered coffee pot, a small sack of beans nearly empty, a whetstone, a spare shirt threadbare at the elbows. Survival was a series of small, practiced motions. He knelt by the fire pit, scooping out the worst of the damp ash with his hands. From a pile of burlap sacks, he tore off dry strips, wadding them into a loose ball. His fingers, scarred and knotted from years of swinging a pick in the Blackthorn mines before the accident, worked methodically. He pulled a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle from his coat pocket, his tinderbox. Flint struck steel. Sparks cascaded onto the dry fibers. He coaxed a tiny ember with his breath, gentle puffs that warmed his own face for a moment. A fragile flame licked up. Hungry for the dry with splinters, he'd scavenged from the broken stool and carefully added. He felt her watching, a silent, tense presence near the door. The infant whimpered again, a thin, reedy sound. Silas didn't look up, focusing on feeding the fledgling fire. "Shut the door," he said, his voice gruff. "Keep what heat we can." The door scraped shut, plunging the shack into gloom relieved only by the growing orange glow of the fire. Shadows leapt on the rough adobe walls. Silas added larger pieces of broken wood he gathered outside earlier. Remnants of fence, dry branches from beneath the snow-laden pinyon scrub. The fire caught, crackling, pushing back the chill by inches. Its light revealed the starkness of their refuge and the utter destitution of the woman. Her dress was thin calico, patched and stained, utterly inadequate. Her shoes were little more than scraps of leather bound with twine. She sank on the pile of sacks near the fire, her movement stiff with cold, hunching over the bundle in her arms, trying to shield it with her body. Silas rummaged in his saddlebags. The beans were too precious, needing hours to cook they didn't have. He found a small, hard cake of pemmican, dried meat, and berries pounded with fat, his emergency ration. He broke it in half, the action automatic, ingrained from a time when sharing a meager meal meant survival for the group. He held out the larger piece toward her. "Ain't much, but it'll keep the cold out some." She looked at the offered food, then at his face, her eyes searching his with an intensity that surprised him. It wasn't just gratitude. It was assessment, calculation beneath the weariness. Slowly, she reached out and took it. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." Her voice was a little stronger now, a low, clear tone despite the rasp of fatigue. "I'm Eleanor." She didn't offer a last name. She nibbled the pemmican, her gaze darting around the shack again, lingering on the shadows near the back wall. One hand, while she ate, drifted unconsciously to her throat, fingers brushing against something hidden beneath the layers of her threadbare shawl. A faint, metallic glint catching the firelight for an instant before disappearing. A locket, perhaps. Silas chewed his own small portion slowly, savoring the greasy, gamey taste. The fire's warmth seeped into his bones, a temporary reprieve. He watched Eleanor tend to the baby, unwrapping the rags just enough to reveal a tiny, pinched face. She touched the infant's cheek with fingertip, a gesture of such profound tenderness it made Silas look away, a familiar ache blooming in his chest. He touched the small, hard shape in his own vest pocket. The dented brass casing of his father's pocket watch stopped at 3:17 on a day 5 years past when the timbers gave way in the Blackthorn No. 3. He dug for hours until his hands bled, finding only silence in this broken relic. The weight of it was always there, a cold counterpoint to the pulse in his wrist. "Storm set in hard," he muttered, more to break the silence heavy with unspoken histories than to state the obvious. He rose, stiffly, and moved a small, grimy window, peering out through a crack where the hide covering had torn away. The world beyond was a swirling white void, visibility reduced to a few yards. The relentless wind moaned against the walls. Then, beneath the wind's howl, he heard it, faint, distorted by distance in the muffling snow, but unmistakable. The rhythmic thud of hoofbeats, not a single rider, several, moving fast despite the conditions, coming from the direction of the main trail, leading towards Blackthorn Ridge, where the company's foreman's office and the newer mine works lay. His spine stiffened. No one rode like that in a blizzard without damn good reason, trouble or pursuit. He turned slowly back to the fire. Eleanor had frozen, the pemmican halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide and fixed on him. She'd heard it too. The fear was back, raw and immediate, eclipsing her exhaustion. She pulled the baby closer, her knuckles white. Silas kept his voice low, calm. Hunting party, maybe. Lost. He didn't believe it. The basin was hunted out, and lost men didn't ride with that kind of purpose in a wideout. He saw the doubt in her eyes, the way her gaze flickered toward the door, then back to the shadowed corner where she'd been sitting. Had she drawn something in the dirt floor near the sacks? A quick mark hastily scuffed out? He couldn't be sure in the flickering light. The hoofbeats faded, swallowed by the storm, but the tension in the small shack didn't ease. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks upwards. Eleanor finally took the bite of pemmican, chewing mechanically, her eyes never leaving Silas. The silence stretched, thick with the wind's moan and the infant's soft, irregular breaths. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the noise like a knife. "They won't stop looking, Mr. Thorne." She stared into the flames, her expression hardening into something fierce and desperate. "My husband, he knew things. About the veins, about the ledgers. He tried to make them see." She trailed off, her jaw clenched, a muscle jumping in her cheek. She looked down at the baby, her voice dropping even lower, thick with emotion Silas couldn't name. "They took everything, burned the cabin, said it was an accident to fire." Her hand went to her throat again, clutching the hidden object beneath the shawl. "But he gave me this. Proof. Before they..." Her words choked off, leaving the horrifying implication hanging in the frigid air, far colder than the storm outside. Proof. Proof of what? And who were they? The hoofbeats suddenly seemed much closer than they were. Silas Thorne stared at the desperate widow and her child, realizing the weight of his last dollar had just become the weight of a world of trouble. The fire crackled, the only sound against the gathering storm and the terrifying silence that followed Eleanor's broken confession. Silence, thick and brittle as river ice, settled over the shack after Eleanor's choked words. The fire's crackle seemed unnaturally loud, each pop a punctuation mark to the terrifying implication hanging in the frigid air. Proof. They took everything, burned the cabin. Silas Thorne stared at the young woman hunched over her infant, her knuckles white where they clutched the hidden locket beneath her shawl. The fading echo of hoofbeats, swallowed by the blizzard's howl, felt like a countdown. Blackthorn Consolidated wasn't just a name on a mine entrance. It was a crushing weight that had buried his own past. Now it hunted a widow and a newborn over something hidden in a piece of jewelry. Coldwater Notch. The name surfaced in Silas's mind like a buoy in a storm. A 2-day ride in good weather, a speck of a settlement clinging to the southern edge of the basin, far from Blackthorn's immediate reach, a place with a telegraph wire tenuously connecting it to the outside world. It was the only chance. Staying here meant freezing, starving, or being found. "They won't stop looking," Eleanor had said. She was right. Men who burned cabins wouldn't balk at searching a derelict shack. "We ride," Silas stated, the words cutting through the tense quiet. His voice was low, flat, the voice of a man making a decision that offered only different flavors of peril. Storms breaking a might, enough to move. It wasn't true. The wind still screamed against the adobe walls. Snow hissed against a lone window. But waiting was surrender. Eleanor's head snapped up, fear warring with a desperate spark of hope. "Ride? Where? In this?" "Coldwater Notch," Silas said, already moving. He kicked dirt over the fire, plunging the shack into near darkness, conserving precious fuel for later. The sudden gloom felt like a shroud. Got a wire there. Sheriff, maybe? Someone not on Blackthorn's payroll. He hoped. Silver Vein Basin's law tended to bend towards whoever held the most ore. He began gathering his meager belongings with swift efficiency. The saddlebags, the empty coffee pot, the worn wool blanket from his bedroll. Too thin for this cold, but better than nothing. He hesitated, then pulled a small, oiled rag from a saddlebag pocket, unwrapping it to reveal a heavy, single-action Colt Peacemaker. Its blued steel worn but clean. He checked the cylinder. The metallic clicked sharp in the gloom. It held 5 rounds. He hadn't fired it in anger since the number 3. The familiar weight felt alien, a relic from a life buried under rockfall. He shoved it into his waistband, the cold metal biting through his shirt. Eleanor watched him, her eyes huge in the dim light. She saw the gun, flinched almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Thorne, Silas, you don't have to." "Don't." He cut her off, his tone harsher than intended. He softened it, just a fraction. "Ain't about choice anymore. It's about getting clear of this basin before they box us in." He nodded toward the infant. "Wrap that child tight. Use this." He tossed her his spare shirt, thin flannel, but dry. "Wind'll cut like glass out there." He saw the tremor in her hands as she took the shirt, the fierce concentration as she began layering it over the baby's existing rags, tucking the edges with meticulous care. The infant, sensing the disturbance, let out a thin, reedy cry. Eleanor shushed it, a low, soothing hum that seemed to steady her own nerves as much as a child's. Her resilience, forged in desperation, was palpable. She didn't weep, didn't falter in the task. She simply did what needed doing. The sight of it, the fierce maternal focus amidst the terror, stirred something long dormant in Silas, a protective urge deeper than mere decency. It wasn't just pity anymore. It was kinship forged in the crucible of Blackthorn's shadow. As she worked, her hand brushed against her throat again, a reflexive gesture. The firelight, almost extinguished, caught the edge of the hidden locket for a split second. "My husband," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the wind, her eyes fixed on the baby's face. Jonas, he was the assayer. For Blackthorn knew the true yield of the South Vein, knew the ledgers didn't match. Her jaw tightened. He tried to tell them. The foreman, Cobb, he just smiled, called him mistaken. Then the fire. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The proof, whatever it was, a sliver of a assay report, a coded note, a hidden map etched on the lockets inside, was Jonas's legacy and their death warrant if found. Silas remembered Jonas Reed, a quiet man, precise, always squinting at rocks through his eyeglass. He'd assayed the Silas and his crew pulled from number 3. The memory had collapsed. The sudden groan of stressed timber, the choking dust, the screams cut short, slammed into him with physical force. He leaned against the cold adobe wall, the rough surface grounding him. 5 years. 5 years of drifting, the stopped pocket watch in his vest a cold, constant reminder. Now, another man silenced by Blackthorn, another family shattered. The pattern was sickeningly clear. Cobb's smiling face surfaced in his mind. The foreman who dismissed the concerns about number 3 supports weeks before they failed. "Reckon Cobb don't like being told he's wrong," Silas said grimly, pushing off the wall. "Ready?" Eleanor nodded. The bundled infant, now a snug parcel held tightly against her chest, sheltered within the folds of Silas's flannel shirt beneath her shawl. Her face was pale but set. "Ready." Stepping outside was like walking into a freezing white fist. The wind stole Silas's breath, driving snow horizontally, stinging any exposed skin. Visibility was less than 20 yards. The skeletal shapes of the ghost town dissolving into swirling gray. He led the way to the sagging livery stable where his only possession of value stood, a rangy, deep-chested bay gelding named Brute, as tough and taciturn as his owner. Brute snorted, his breath pluming thickly, his coat already crusted with snow. Silas quickly saddled him, the leather stiff with cold. He helped Eleanor mount, settling her awkwardly sideways in front of the saddle horn, the baby cradled between her body and the pommel. He lashed his saddlebags behind the cantle, then swung up behind her. The closeness was necessary but uncomfortable, a barrier of shared dread and shared body heat. "Hold tight," he muttered, gathering the reins. He nudged Brute forward, the horse stepping cautiously into Maelstrom. They moved like ghosts through a world erased. The trail south, barely discernible in summer, was utterly obliterated. Silas navigated by instinct and memory of the land's contours, keeping the howling wind mostly at their backs. Brute plodded steadily, head down, trusting his rider. Silas scanned the swirling white constantly, ears straining past the wind's roar for any unnatural sound, a shout, a hoofbeat out of rhythm. The cold seeped through layers of wool and leather, a relentless ache settling into bones. Eleanor shivered violently against him, her body rigid with effort and fear. He felt the tiny movements of the infant bundle against his chest. Alive. For now, that fragile life became his compass point. After an hour of grueling progress, the wind dropped for a few eerie moments, the snow falling straight down in fat, silent flakes. They were skirting the base of a rocky outcrop, seeking scant shelter. Silas dismounted, needing to check their bearings and give Brute a brief rest. He scanned the ground near the rocks, hoping for a familiar landmark. His boot scuffed something hard beneath the fresh powder. He bent, brushing snow aside. It was a spur rowel, snapped off its shank. Not old. The metal gleamed dully, sharp-edged, free of significant rust. Blackthorn men often wore heavy Mexican-style spurs. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather traced Silas's spine. Someone had passed here recently, moving with enough haste or carelessness to break gear. He pocketed the rowel, a cold, metallic weight of confirmation. "Mount up," he said tersely, helping Eleanor back onto Brute. No stopping. He chose a different route now, veering away from the faint trace of the main trail, leading Brute up a steeper, rockier slope dotted with stunted pinyon pines. It was harder going, but offered more cover and fewer tracks in the deep snow. He doubled back twice, leading Brute through dense scrub, trying to obscure their path, knowing it was a temporary measure against determined trackers in the storm. The tension was a living thing between them. Silas felt Eleanor's fear radiating like cold. He found himself speaking, needing to break the suffocating silence, to offer some sliver of shared humanity. "Number 3, he said, the words ripped away by the wind but reaching her ear. "My crew, 5 years back. Timbers gave way. Cobb." He'd been told they were weak. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Her sharp intake of breath, the slight press of her back against his chest, told him she understood the unspoken accusation, the shared enemy. They pushed on, the day bleeding into a gray, early twilight. The storm intensified again, the wind shrieking with renewed fury. Silas knew they needed water. He remembered a seep spring near an old prospector's dug out halfway to Coldwater Notch. They reached the sheltered hollow as full dark threatened. The dugout was little more than a depression in the hillside, partially roofed with rotting timbers, but offered respite from the wind. Silas dismounted stiffly, his legs numb. "Wait here," he instructed Eleanor, tethering Brute to a sturdy pinion. "Spring's just around that bend. Fill the canteen." He handed her the battered tin canteen from his saddle. It was an act of trust, leaving her alone, even briefly. Her eyes met his, wide and scared, but she nodded, clutching the canteen like a lifeline. He moved quickly around a rocky outcrop, relief washing over him as he spotted a familiar dark stain of water seeping from the rocks into a shallow stone basin, miraculously unfrozen despite the cold. He knelt, scooping handfuls of icy water to his mouth. It tasted of stone and freedom. He refilled his own small canteen first, then pulled out the larger one he'd handed Eleanor. As he uncorked it, his fingers found the strap. It was severed, not worn through, not torn, cleanly cut, halfway down the leather length, the edges sharp. Sabotage, deliberate. His blood ran colder than the spring water. They hadn't just found the shack. They'd been close enough to get to his horse, to his gear, while he was distracted helping Eleanor inside, close enough to ensure they wouldn't have water for the punishing journey ahead. A message and a death sentence wrapped in one. He stood slowly, the ruined canteen dangling from his hand. He scanned the swirling snow above the rocky hollow, the skeletal trees clinging to the slope. His gaze swept upwards, towards a jagged ridgeline silhouetted against the slightly lighter gloom of the snow-filled sky. Movement, a darker shape against the gray-white, distinct for a fraction of a second before merging back into the storm. A man, standing tall, watching, not lost, not hunting game, watching them. Silas didn't move, didn't breathe. The figure didn't wave, didn't shout. It simply stood, an ominous sentinel etched against the ridge, confirming the relentless, patient pursuit. Then, as silently as it appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the blizzard. But the image burned into Silas's mind. The watcher on the ridge. They were seen. They were hunted. And their water was gone. The vast, frozen wilderness of the Silver Vein Basin suddenly felt like a tightening noose. He turned, the ruined canteen a heavy, useless weight in his hand, and walked back towards Eleanor, the storm howling its triumphant dirge around him. The ruined canteen strap felt like a brand in Silas's hand, colder than the metal itself. He walked back toward the dugout hollow. The image of the watcher on the ridge burned onto his retinas, a stark, dark silhouette against the swirling gray, motionless and malevolent. It wasn't just pursuit, it was a declaration. They were seen, tracked, and now crippled. No water. The storm's howl seemed to mock their predicament. Eleanor stood where he'd left her, pressed against Brute's solid flank for scant warmth and shelter. Her eyes, wide and searching in the gloom, locked onto the dangling canteen in his hand. Understanding dawned, swift and terrible, draining the little color left in her face. She didn't ask. She simply clutched the bundled infant tighter against her chest, a low whimper escaping the baby, quickly stifled by the wind. "Cut," Silas said, the single word carrying the weight of their peril. He held up the severed strap. "While we were in the shack." He saw the tremor run through her, the way her free hand flew to her throat, fingers digging beneath the layers of shawl and flannel, seeking the hidden locket. Proof worth this. "We have to go. Now." His voice was gravel-scraped raw. He shoved the useless canteen into his saddlebag. The larger one, still full, was his only reserve. He checked the Colt at his waist again, a grim ritual. 5 rounds against an unseen number. They mounted again, Silas settling behind Eleanor, the closeness now charged with a new, desperate urgency. Brute, sensing the shift, snorted, his breath pluming thickly in the freezing air. Silas turned the gelding away from the main, obliterated trail and deeper into the teeth of the storm, aiming for a treacherous notch he remembered between 2 jagged escarpments. The Devil's Staircase. It was shorter, steeper, riskier, but offered more cover and fewer places for riders to flank them. The direct route was suicide now. The wind screamed down the narrow canyons, funneled into a force that threatened to pluck them from the saddle. Snow, driven like needles, stung any exposed skin. Ice rimed the sheer rock faces on either side like shattered glass, glittering dully in the fading light. Brute's hooves slipped and scrabbled on hidden ice beneath the deep powder. Silas leaned forward, guiding the horse with minute shifts of weight and rein, his entire world narrowed to the next precarious step, the next gust threatening to blind them. Eleanor was rigid before him, her body a tense shield for the infant, her head bent low against the onslaught. Silas felt the small, frantic heartbeat of the baby against his own chest through the layers of clothing, a fragile metronome ticking against the vast indifference of the storm and the hunters at their backs. Hours bled together in a haze of cold, fear, and exhaustion. The light leached from the sky, turning the swirling snow into a ghostly gray shroud. Silas's hands were numb on the reins, his legs blocks of ice. He scanned constantly, not just the trail, but for any flicker of movement, any unnatural shadow in the whiteout. His mind kept circling back to the watcher. Had it been Cobb himself, or one of his hired wolves? Men like Rafe Sutter, known for his cruel efficiency and utter lack of mercy? Men who'd likely been at the Reed cabin fire. The memory of number 3 surged back, unbidden and vivid. The dust-choked darkness, the screams abruptly silenced, the frantic digging until his hands bled onto the unyielding rock, finding only to stop pocket watch later, clutched in his father's lifeless hand. He'd told Cobb about the groaning timbers weeks before. Cobb had clapped him on the shoulder, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. Worry about digging, Thorne, not the props. Company knows what it's doing. The same company that silenced assayers who found inconvenient truths. The pattern was a noose tightening around them all. He felt Eleanor shift slightly. Her hand emerged from the folds sheltering the baby, clutching the locket, not opening it, just holding it tightly in her fist, her knuckles white, a silent vow, a burden shared only with the howling wind. "We need shelter," Silas rasped, his throat parched. The cold was leeching their strength, their will. Can't push brute much further in this dark. He remembered an old prospect hole, more of a shallow cave, really, gouged into the base of a massive sandstone outcrop near the head of the staircase. Dangerous, prone to slides, but it was something. Finding it in the near-total darkness and driving snow was a feat of desperate memory. He almost rode past the dark, irregular mouth half buried in a snowdrift. Dismounting was agony, stiff limbs protesting. He helped Eleanor down, her legs buckling slightly. She leaned heavily against Brute, swaying with exhaustion, but still cradling the baby protectively. Silas led the horse into the shallow cave, just deep enough for him to huddle out of the direct wind. It smelled of damp stone, old earth, and animal musk. He unsaddled Brute quickly, rubbing the exhausted animal down with handfuls of coarse snow before draping his own thin saddle blanket over the gelding's back. It wasn't enough, but it was all he had. He scraped snow from the cave floor near the entrance, clearing a space. Using the last precious shreds of dry tinder from his oilskin pouch and splinters that were broken from a long-dead juniper root protruding from the cave wall, he coaxed a tiny, flickering fire to life in the sheltered hollow. The feeble warmth was a benediction, pushing back the encroaching dark and cold by mere inches. It was a risk. Light could be seen, but freezing to death was a certainty without it. They huddled close to the meager flames. Silas shared out the last of the pemmican, a pitifully small piece each. He scooped clean snow into the battered coffee pot and set it near the fire to melt. Water. It felt like a miracle, even lukewarm and tasting of tin. Eleanor sipped slowly, then carefully trickled a few drops onto her fingertip, letting the baby suckle the moisture. The infant's weak mewling subsided into exhausted sleep. In the fragile circle of firelight, the lines of strain and fear on Eleanor's face were stark. She looked at the locket in her palm, then at Silas, her eyes reflecting the tiny flames. "He knew," she whispered, her voice hoarse but clear in the relative quiet of the cave. The wind still moaned outside, a constant reminder. Jonas, he kept his own records. Secret, not just the yield, the cost. Men hurt, paid off, or silenced. Her fingers traced the locket's edge. He found the original claim marker, buried, deliberately, proved the south vein, half of it. It wasn't Blackthorn's to take. It belonged to a partner, Silas Morgan. Vanished years ago. No kin, they said. Her gaze locked onto Silas's. But there was kin, a daughter, back east. Jonas wrote her, sent proof before. She swallowed hard, the unspoken before they killed him, hanging in the air. This, she touched the locket, has her name, the marker location, copies of his notes, tiny, on oilskin. Cobb would burn the basin down to keep it buried. They'll kill for it. Silas stared at her, the pieces falling into place with a sickening clarity. Not just fraud, but theft on a massive scale, and murder to cover it. The weight of her trust, the enormity of what she carried, settled on him like the mountain above them. He touched the cold brass of his father's stopwatch through his vest. Failure wasn't an option, Not again. We get to cold water, he said, his voice low and fierce. Get that wire sent. Find that daughter. He felt a surge of defiance, fragile but bright against encompassing dread. Ain't just running no more. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the wind's moan. Not natural. A shout, distant, distorted by the storm and the rocks, but unmistakably human. And angry. Then another, closer. Silas froze, hand instinctively going to Colt. Eleanor's breath hitched, her eyes wide with terror. They'd found the trail, or the fire's glow. Silas scrambled to the cave mouth, peering out into the chaotic white darkness. He could see nothing but the swirling snow. But the voices came again, clearer this time, carried on a brief lull in the wind. Tracks lead this way, damn it. Check that ridge. He's holed up somewhere. Rafe Sutter's distinctive rasp was unmistakable. Too close. Far too close. He kicked snow over the tiny fire, plunging him into near total darkness. Mount up, he hissed, urgency like ice in his veins. Quiet as ghosts. He grabbed the barely warm coffee pot, the precious water sloshing inside. Every second counted. He helped Eleanor onto Brute, the horse snorting softly in protest. Silas swung up behind her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He nudged Brute forward, out of Cave's meager shelter and back into the storm's fury, turning them away from the voices, deeper into the maze of rock and snow at the top of the staircase. They moved like phantoms, Brute picking his way with instinctive care on the treacherous, snow-covered slope. Silas strained his ears, every nerve screaming. The shouts seemed to echo from multiple directions now, disorienting. Had they split up? He guided Brute toward a narrow gully he remembered, hoping it would shield them and confuse their trail. Suddenly, Brute shied violently, snorting in alarm. Silas hauled back on the reins, peering ahead. The gully mouth was partially blocked, not by snow, by freshly tumbled rocks, some as big as barrels. It looked like a natural slide, triggered by the storm. But Silas's eye, trained in the mines, caught the unnatural angle of a sapling wedged under the largest boulder near the top of the pile. A lever, deliberately placed. And near it, half buried in the snow, a glint of metal. Another broken spur rowel, identical to the one he'd found earlier. It wasn't a slide. It was a trap, rigged, designed to funnel them, to block escape, or worse, to crush them. They'd anticipated his route. They were hurting them. Before Silas could react, a sharp whistle pierced the storm from the ridge above them. A signal. He whipped his head around, squinting through the blinding snow. Dark shapes materialized along the ridgeline to their left. 3, maybe 4, silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky. Then movement to their right. More shadows detaching themselves from the rocks, lower down, cutting off the gully retreat. They were surrounded, hemmed in on the exposed slope. The trap was sprung. Silas's hand closed on the Colt's grip. 5 rounds. Against how many? Brute stamped nervously, sensing the closing danger. Eleanor made a small, choked sound, pressing the baby's face against her chest, her body a shield. The wind howled its triumphant chorus. The dark figures on the ridges began to move, descending slowly, deliberately, like wolves closing on cornered prey. The snow swirled around them, but their intent was clear as gunmetal. There was nowhere left to run. Time crystallized. The wind's howl faded into a distant thrumming in Silas Thorne's ears, replaced by the frantic hammering of his own heart against his ribs. Dark figures solidified out of the swirling snow on the ridges above and to their right, blocking the gully retreat. Trapped, hemmed in on an exposed, snow-choked slope. The rigged rock slide behind them wasn't just a barrier. It was a grim promise of how this would end if they stayed. 5 rounds in the Colt, against shadows multiplying in the storm. Brute stamped, nostrils flaring wide, sensing the closing ring of danger. Eleanor pressed the baby's face deeper into her chest, her body rigid with terror, a low moan escaping her lips. Silas's hand clenched on the Colt's grip, slick with sweat despite the cold. Fight? Against unseen numbers on high ground? Flee? Where? Back toward the slide? Straight into men below? Think, damn you, like in the tunnels. The memory flashed, not a collapse, but of a cave in years before, smaller, trapped with two others, air thick with dust and panic. His father's voice, eerily calm, look for the weak spot, Silas, the crack the light finds. His gaze, frantic, scanned the sheer rock face to their immediate left, not a solid wall, jagged, fractured sandstone, and near its base, almost hidden by a wind-sculpted snowdrift, a darker vertical line, a crevice, narrow, barely wider than Brute's shoulders, a crack the light or desperation found. It was madness, a gamble against the mountain itself, but staying with certain death. Hold tight, Silas rasped, the command slicing through Eleanor's fear. He didn't wait. He kicked Brute hard, not forward or back, but left directly toward the sheer rock face and the slender, dark fissure. Simultaneously, he yanked the Colt free, pointed it not at the figures, but high into the air above the men on the lower right ridge, and fired. The report was a thunderclap in confined space, echoing off the rocks, momentarily drowning the wind. Snow dislodged from ledges above in powdery cascades. The dark figures flinched, ducked instinctively. One, lower and closer than the rest, silhouetted against the gray, stumbled back a step. Rafe Sutter. Silas knew the bulky outline, the arrogant set of shoulders even in the blur of snow. Thorne, you're boxing like a damn badger. Sutter's voice, rough and taunting, carried down. Give us the woman. Save the lead for the brat. Cruel laughter, thin and sharp, came from another shadow. The words were a physical blow. Eleanor gasped, shrinking back against Silas. Fury, cold and pure, surged through him, burning away the paralyzing fear. It wasn't just about the locket anymore. It was about the woman trembling against him, the fragile life she shielded. The gunshot served its purpose, a heartbeat of distraction. Brute, driven by Silas's heels and the primal urge to escape the echoing noise and the closing threat, lunged forward. He plunged into the narrow crevice, snow exploding around his legs. Stone scraped harshly against leather saddle skirts. Eleanor cried out, ducking low, pressing herself and the baby flat against Brute's neck as rock grazed her shoulder. Silas held his breath, urging the big horse deeper into the suffocating darkness of the crack. It was tight, agonizingly so. Jagged stone tore at his coat sleeve. Behind them, shouts erupted, confused, angry. The hell? After them, a shot rang out, the bullet pinging harmlessly off the rock face yard behind them, lost in the storm's drone. The crevice twisted, descending slightly, then opened abruptly into a small, sheltered pocket, a natural chimney hidden within the rock. Snow lay deep here, but the wind was cut to a whisper. Brute stood trembling, flanks heaving, steam rising thickly from his coat. Silas scanned the way they'd come. No immediate pursuit. The crevice was too narrow, too treacherous for mounted men to follow quickly, especially blinded by snow and surprise. They'd bought minutes. Precious, stolen minutes. Eleanor was shaking uncontrollably, tears freezing on her cheeks. He meant it about the baby. She choked out, her voice raw with horror. I know, Silas said, his own voice tight. He dismounted stiffly, his legs protesting. He moved to Brute's head, calming the horse with a rough hand on his muzzle. Ain't gonna happen. The words were a vow, spoken as much to the memory of number 3 as to her. He'd failed his father, his crew. He wouldn't fail them. He looked at Eleanor, her face pale and smudged with dirt in the dim light, filtering through the snow-choked crack above. The locket. What's in it? Exactly. Her hand flew to her throat, protective. It's all I have left of Jonas and her chance. Her chance might be our only chance now, Eleanor. Silas pressed, urgency sharpening his tone. Sutter saw us head this way. They'll find this pocket or circle around. We need to know what we're carrying." Hesitation warred with desperation in her eyes. Then, with trembling fingers, she fumbled beneath her layers, pulling out the small, tarnished silver locket on its thin chain. She pried it open with numb fingers. Inside, no picture. Instead, nestled against the metal, were two tightly rolled, tiny scrolls of oilskin and a slip of paper with faded, cramped writing. She held out toward Silas, not letting go, the fire of defiance battling the terror in her gaze. The paper, her name, Abigail Morgan, St. Louis. The oilskin, one has the true map of the South Vein claim marker Jonas found buried. Coordinates. The other, she swallowed, lists names, men hurt in accidents Cobb ordered. Dates, payments made to keep quiet, or disappearances. Jonas's notes. Silas stared at the tiny repository of truth. Proof of theft, proof of murder. Enough to bury Blackthorn consolidated and send Cobb and Sutter to the gallows. No wonder they hunted like wolves. It wasn't just greed, it was survival. The weight of it was staggering. He touched the stopped pocket watch in his vest. Proof silenced, just like his father. "We get this to Coldwater," he said, his voice thick. "Get it on the wire. Find Abigail Morgan." He saw the flicker of fragile hope in Eleanor's eyes, the first since the cave. "Can you ride?" She nodded, tucking the locket away with a finality that felt like sealing a pact. "I can ride." They pushed on, leaving the hidden pocket and navigating a treacherous descent down the backside of the formation, avoiding the Devil's Staircase proper. The storm, as if acknowledging their desperate bid, began to relent. The wind dropped from a shriek to a low moan. The snow fell less densely, shifting from blinding sheets to fat, drifting flakes. Visibility improved to 100 yards, then 200. The landscape emerged, a vast, frozen basin floor stretching before them, dotted with dark clusters of mesquite scrub and yucca, skeletal sentinels in the white. On the far southern horizon, a smudge of darker gray against the clouds hinted at higher ground. Coldwater Notch. Hope, frail but tangible, flickered. They had a direction. They had the proof. They had a name. But the cost was high. Brute's head hung lower. His steps were heavy, plodding. They'd eaten the last crumb of pemmican hours ago. The coffee pot held perhaps 2 cups of melted snow, now stone cold. Silas's own strength was ebbing, a deep, bone-weary cold settling, and that the meager hope couldn't fully dispel. Eleanor leaned against him, her earlier rigidity replaced by the limpness of utter exhaustion, though her arms still cradled the sleeping baby with fierce protectiveness. They followed a frozen creek bed, the ice thick and treacherous beneath the snow cover, but it offered the straightest path south. The silence was profound, broken only by Brute's labored breathing, the crunch of snow, and the distant cry of a hawk. The absence of pursuit felt more ominous than reassuring. Sutter wasn't the type to give up. He was out there, circling, calculating. As dusk began to stain the snowy world lavender and gray, the low shapes of buildings coalesced ahead. Not a town, not yet. A scatter of structures, a larger log cabin, a sagging barn, a corral, and a smaller, square building with a single wire strung from a high pole beside it, leading south. The Coldwater Telegraph Station. A way station, maybe a homestead. Salvation. Relief, sharp and sweet, washed over Silas. He urged Brute into a weary trot. "Almost there, girl," he murmured, to the horse, to Eleanor, to himself. Almost there. They reached the edge of the small clearing surrounding the buildings. No smoke rose from the cabin chimney. No light showed in the windows. An unnatural stillness hung over the place, deeper than the winter hush. Silas's relief curdled into foreboding. He slowed Brute, his hand drifting towards a colt. "Hello, the station," he called out, his voice hoarse but carrying in the quiet. No answer, only the sigh of the wind to the pines behind the buildings. He dismounted stiffly, signaling Eleanor to stay put. He approached the telegraph office first, the smaller building. The door hung slightly ajar. He pushed it open with the muzzle of the Colt. Inside, chaos. The small operator's desk was overturned. Papers were strewn everywhere. The telegraph key itself, the instrument of hope, lay smashed on the floor, its brass components bent, wires ripped out. The wooden casing was splintered as if struck by a heavy boot. Sabotage. Deliberate, violent destruction. Silas stood in the doorway, the cold air from outside swirling around him. Colder than the winter chill. The fragile hope that carried him across the frozen basin shattered like the instrument at his feet. They had reached the wire, and the wire was dead. Before the crushing weight of the setback could fully settle, a voice, thin and reedy, spoke from the shadows near the corner of the sagging barn, 20 yards away. "Lookin' for the operator, mister?" An old man stepped into view, bundled in layers of ragged furs, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick. His face was a road map of wrinkles, his eyes pale and watery, but sharp. He chewed slowly on something, watching Silas with unnerving stillness. "Won't find him. Took off 3 days back. Scared." The old man spat a stream of dark liquid into the snow. Said men was coming. Bad men. A skin questions about a woman. A widow. His pale eyes flickered past Silas to where Eleanor sat frozen on Brute, and about a name, Morgan, Silas Morgan. He paused, his gaze returning to Silas, holding it with unsettling intensity. "Reckon I knew Silas Morgan. Long time ago, before he vanished, before Blackthorn dug his claws in." He took another slow step forward, his stick sinking deep into the snow. Heard tell he had a daughter, back east, pretty name, Abigail. The old man's words hung in the frigid air, sharp as icicles. Abigail Morgan. He knew the name. He knew Silas Morgan. Hope, a frail bird that had briefly taken flight at the side of the telegraph station, plummeted, dashed against the rocks of the smashed quay, and Jeremiah's grim news. Men asking about a widow, about Morgan. Sutter was close, closer than they dared fear. Silas's hand tightened on the Colt's grip, the cold metal of familiar, desperate anchor. He turned slowly from the ruined telegraph office, his gaze sweeping the silent homestead, the dark, empty cabin, the sagging barn, the corral filled only with drifted snow. Jeremiah stood watching him, pale eyes unreadable in his weathered face, leaning on his gnarled stick. Eleanor sat rigid on Brute, her face ashen, one arm wrapped protectively around the baby, the other hand instinctively clutching the hidden locket beneath her layers. The silence was profound, broken only by Brute's labored breathing and the soft, ominous sigh of the wind through the nearby pines. "Men comin'," Jeremiah stated flatly, nodding toward the trail they'd just ridden on, already beginning to blur under fresh snowfall. "Heard 'em. Horses. 6, maybe 7. Moving slow, careful. Hunting." Panic threatened to choke Silas. 6 or 7 against his 5 bullets. Eleanor exhausted. The baby vulnerable. Brute near foundered. The open basin offered no cover. The homestead buildings were death traps. His eyes darted to the stand of pines behind the barn. Thick old growth. Snow-laden boughs scraping the ground. A possibility. A terrible risk. Jeremiah, Silas rasped, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "You know these woods? A place? Closed." The old man chewed slowly, his gaze flickering towards the pines. "Got a dugout. Back in there. Mine shaft. Cave long before my time. Entrance at good. Sheltered." He spat. "Ain't comfortable. But it's hid." It was their only chance. Take her, the baby, now. Silas gestured urgently towards Eleanor. "Get him inside. Bar the door if you can." Jeremiah didn't hesitate. He shuffled towards Brute, surprisingly spry despite his stick. "Come on, girl. Down you get. Quick now." He held up a gnarled hand to help Eleanor dismount. Her eyes met Silas's, filled with terror that mirrored the icy dread in his own gut, but beneath it a fierce, determined light. "Silas." "Go!" He cut her off, his voice harsh with urgency. "Get that child safe." He saw the flash of the locket chain as she moved, Jeremiah steadying her. Proof. Abigail Morgan. It couldn't be lost. Not now. As Jeremiah half led, half supported Eleanor and the baby toward the dark wall of pines, vanishing into gloom like ghosts, Silas turned back to Brute. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard, a heavy, single-shot Sharps, slow but powerful. He levered a round into the chamber. 5 in the Colt, 1 in the Sharps. Against 7, he led Brute away from the buildings, toward a cluster of snow-crusted yucca plants and a low, tumble-down stone wall near the trail entrance. He looped the reins loosely over a yucca stalk, a decoy, a focus. Then he ran, crouching low, back towards a sagging barn, slipping around its far side where the shadows were deepest, pressing himself against the rough, cold logs. He had the high ground, slight but crucial. He could see the trail approach, the homestead yard, Brute standing head lower by the wall. He didn't have to wait long. Shapes emerged from the swirling snow down the trail. 6 riders, moving cautiously, spread out. Rafe Sutter rode point, his bulky frame unmistakable, a Winchester carbine resting across his saddle. His eyes, sharp and cruel, scanned the homestead, lingering on the open telegraph office door, then on Brute standing sentinel by the wall. Well, Sutter called out, his voice carrying easily in the sudden lull of wind. "Look what the blizzard blew in. Lost your passengers, Thorne? Or you finally come to your senses?" He reined in, his men fanning out slightly behind him, hands near holsters or rifles. They looked hard, seasoned by winter and violence, their breath pluming in the cold air. Silas remained silent, pressed against the barn, the Sharps brace against his shoulder, sighted on Sutter's chest. The Colt was heavy in his waistband. "Wait, make them come closer." Sutter's gaze swept the buildings again, suspicion hardening his features. "Where's the woman, Thorne? The brat? Cobb wants what she stole, and he wants it quiet." He nudged his horse forward a few steps. "Get her up, hand over that trinket she's clutching, and maybe you walk away. This time." The lie was as thick as the snow. Silas's finger tightened on the Sharps trigger. The memory of number 3 flooded him. The groaning timbers Cobb had ignored, the dust, the silence after roar, the stopped watch in his father's hand. Company knows what it's doing. The same company silencing assayers, burning cabins, hunting a woman and child. The rage, cold and pure, steadied his aim. Sutter took another step, his eyes narrowing as he peered toward the barn shadows. "Last chance, Thorne, or we burn this rat hole down around your—" Silas fired. The Sharps boomed like a small cannon, the recoil slamming into his shoulder. Sutter's horse screamed and reared as a heavy slug tore through the pommel of Sutter's saddle, missing the man by inches but showering him with splinters of leather and wood. Chaos erupted. Sutter cursed violently, fighting his panicked mount. His men scattered, diving for cover behind yucca clumps and snowdrifts, rifles coming up. Silas dropped the empty Sharps, yanked the Colt free, and fired twice in quick succession towards the closest cover where a man was bringing his rifle to bear. Snow and yucca fibers exploded near the man's head, forcing him back down. 3 rounds left. He ducked back as a hail of return fire peppered the barn wall above him, splinters raining down. The air filled with the sharp tang of gunpowder and the panicked shrieks of the horses. He risked a glance. Sutter had dismounted, crouched behind his still skittish horse, his face a mask of fury. "Flank him. Left side." Sutter roared. 2 men broke from cover near the stone wall, sprinting towards the barn's far end. Silas lunged sideways along the barn wall, putting the corner between him and the main group. Just as the 2 flankers rounded the opposite corner, he met them head-on. The first man was fast, bringing up a pistol. Silas fired first. Crack! The man stumbled, clutching his shoulder, his shot going wild into the snow. The second man, older, grizzled, hesitated for a fatal split second. Silas didn't. Crack! The man went down hard, not moving. One round left. Back pressed against a barn corner. Silas heard Sutter bellowing orders, the remaining men repositioning. He was exposed. Trapped. He looked toward the pines. Had Jeremiah gotten them safe? Suddenly, a figure darted from the tree line near the dugout entrance. Eleanor. She wasn't running toward him. She was running past him, towards the overturned telegraph operator's desk visible through the shattered office door. What was she doing? Madness. Eleanor, no! Silas roared, but his voice was lost in the wind and another volley of shots chewing into the barn corner. He saw her dive behind a heavy, overturned desk inside the office, clutching something small and metallic in her hand. The locket? She was opening it. Frantically, she pulled out the tiny oilskin scrolls. Then, with a glance toward Silas's position, she did something astonishing. She pried up a loose floorboard near the desk, tucked one of the oilskin scrolls deep into the gap beneath, and slammed the board back down. The other scroll and the slip of paper with Abigail's name. She thrust back into the locket, snapping it shut and clutching it to her chest. She'd split the proof, hidden the map, kept the list of names and the daughter's location. Sutter had seen her too. The woman in the office. Get her. He rose from behind his horse, firing toward the office door. Silas didn't think. He stepped out from the corner, ignoring the bullets snapping past him, and fired his last round. Crack! Nodded Sutter, but at the thick rope holding a heavy wooden water trough, suspended high beside the cabin porch. The rope parted with a twang. The trough, filled with frozen slush, plummeted like a timberman's axe. It crashed down directly between Sutter and the office door, exploding in a geyser of ice, snow, and splintered wood. Sutter was thrown backwards, swearing. The men rushing toward the office were momentarily stunned, blinded by the icy debris. Silas used the chaos. He sprinted, not towards Eleanor, but past the office, towards the pines where Jeremiah waited, gesturing frantically. Go! Dugout! Now! He yelled at Eleanor, hoping she'd hear. He saw her scramble from behind the desk, Locket clutched tight, and dart out the back of the office, vanishing into the pines towards Jeremiah's gesturing hand. Silas followed, bullets kicking up snow at his heels as Sutter's men recovered. He plunged into the dark, snow-muffled sanctuary of the pines, Jeremiah pulling him into the narrow, almost invisible crack in a rock face that led to the old mine shaft. A heavy timber beam, clearly moved recently, scraped across the entrance behind them, plunging them into near-total darkness, barring the way. Inside it was cold and earthy, but blessedly still and silent. Eleanor huddled on a pile of ancient, dry burlap sacks, rocking the crying baby, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Jeremiah leaned against the timber barricade, listening. Outside, muffled by rock and timber, came Sutter's enraged bellowing. Find them, tear this place apart. Find that woman and that damned Locket. But the entrance was hidden too well. The cursing and searching gradually moved away, back toward the homestead, then faded down the trail, Sutter's frustration echoing in the distance. They were safe. For now. In the dim light filtering through a small, high crack in the rock, Silas sank down beside Eleanor. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving him shaking with exhaustion and the aftermath of fear. He looked at her. She met his gaze, her eyes wide and shadowed, but no longer filled with utter terror. Resolve had taken its place. She held out the locket. The map, it's safe. Hidden. The names, Abigail, they're here. She touched her chest where the locket rested. We'll find her. We have to. Jeremiah stirred. Abigail Morgan, he rasped. Silas Morgan's girl. Pretty name. He talked of her. Last time I saw him, heading towards Blackthorn Ridge to settle accounts. Never came back. He spat into the darkness. Got kin down Socorro way. Runs freight. Got a wire machine in his barn. private, quiet. He looked at Silas, then at Eleanor. Reckon I could make a trip, deliver a message for Silas, and for the little He nodded toward the baby, now quieting in Eleanor's arms. A fragile bridge to the outside world. A chance. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, this time of relief and gratitude. She carefully opened the locket, extracted the slip of paper with Abigail's name and address, and handed it to Jeremiah. Tell her Jonas Reed sent proof that her father's claim is real, that Blackthorn stole it, that we need her help. Jeremiah took the paper, folded it carefully, and tucked it deep into his layers. Reckon I can do that. Silas touched the cold brass of his father's pocket, watched through his vest. He pulled it out, the dented casing catching the faint light. He hadn't looked at it in years. The stopped hand's a monument to finality. Almost without thinking, his numb fingers found a winding stem. He turned it. A faint, hesitant click, click, click sounded in the stillness of the dugout. Then a soft, steady tick, tick, tick. The watch, silent for 5 long years, began to measure time once more. Outside the hidden mine entrance, deep within the sheltering pines of Coldwater Notch, the wind sighed through the branches, carrying the distant, fading echo of hoofbeats riding hard towards Blackthorn Ridge. The storm had passed, leaving the Silver Vein Basin draped in a pristine, silent shroud of snow, beautiful and treacherous. The fight wasn't over. Cobb and Sutter still ruled the ridge. But Silas Thorne looked at Eleanor, at the tiny life in her arms, at the old man holding their fragile hope, and heard the quiet, insistent tick-tick-tick of the watch in his hand. They had proof hidden. They had a name. They had a path forward, carved through the ice and fear. They had survived the storm. The rest, he thought, his gaze meeting Eleanor's defiant, hopeful one. They would face together, tick by precious tick.